You're too scared and too old to understand what real wrestling looks like today." The words hit Hulk Hogan like a Swanton bomb to the chest. Jeff Hardy stood across from him in the WWE locker room, his multicolored hair still damp with sweat, his body covered in fresh welts from the high-risk match he had just completed. What happened in the next 8 seconds would expose the most dangerous divide in modern wrestling. April 3, 2009. Houston, Texas. The Toyota Center locker room was buzzing with post-WrestleMania 25 energy, but in the far corner, away from the celebration and cameras, a confrontation was brewing that would reveal 15 years of generational tension about what wrestling should be. Jeff Hardy, the Charismatic Enigma, sat on a bench, slowly removing his colorful arm sleeves and examining the new bruises that decorated his already scarred body. At 31 years old, Jeff had built his entire career on doing things that made wrestling purists cringe and safety experts panic: ladder matches, cage dives, chair shots, and death-defying aerial maneuvers that had redefined what audiences expected from sports entertainment. Across the locker room, Hulk Hogan was discussing the night's matches with several WWE executives, his voice carrying that familiar authoritative tone that had commanded respect for 3 decades. But his comments about the current generation of wrestlers were making Jeff's blood boil. "I just think some of these guys today are taking unnecessary risks," Hogan had said, his voice loud enough for the entire locker room to hear. "The high-flying stuff, the hardcore elements, the extreme bumps, it's impressive, sure, but it's not sustainable. These wrestlers are going to burn out or hurt themselves permanently before they're 40. Those words felt like a personal attack to Jeff Hardy, whose entire identity was built around pushing boundaries and taking risks that older wrestlers considered reckless or unnecessary. "Wrestling should be about longevity," Hogan continued, now addressing his audience with the confidence of someone who had wrestled well into his 50s. "You need to work smart, not just hard. You need to protect your body so you can have a 20 or 30-year career. All this high-risk, high-impact stuff might get temporary reactions, but it's not a recipe for long-term success." The implications were clear. Hogan was suggesting that wrestlers like Jeff Hardy were sacrificing their futures for short-term crowd reactions, that their approach to wrestling was fundamentally unsustainable and ultimately self-destructive. "The wrestlers who last in this business," Hogan added, his tone suggesting he was sharing profound wisdom, "are the ones who learn to tell stories without relying on death-defying stunts, who can connect with audiences through character and charisma rather than just shock value and athletic risk-taking." Jeff's hands, which had been calmly tending to his post-match injuries, slowly clenched into fists. Every word Hogan spoke felt like a dismissal of everything Jeff had worked to accomplish, every risk he had taken, every scar he had earned in pursuit of giving fans something they had never seen before. The breaking point came when Hogan began discussing the responsibility wrestlers had to set positive examples for younger performers. "When you're constantly pushing the envelope with dangerous spots and extreme violence, you're teaching the next generation that they need to take even bigger risks to get noticed. It's a dangerous cycle that's going to end with someone getting seriously hurt or killed." Jeff could no longer contain his frustration. He stood up from the bench, his 6'1" frame still imposing, despite being smaller than most main-event wrestlers, and walked directly toward Hogan with the purposeful stride of someone who had reached his breaking point. "Hulk," Jeff said, his voice carrying an edge that made nearby wrestlers stop their conversations and pay attention. "I need to talk to you about what you just said about risk-taking and sustainability." Hogan turned toward Jeff with his practiced smile, the expression of someone accustomed to being approached by fellow wrestlers, seeking advice or approval. "Hey, Jeff. Hell of a match tonight, brother. You really know how to get the crowd on their feet." The condescending tone in Hogan's voice, the suggestion that he was complimenting Jeff on basic crowd reaction rather than recognizing his artistic innovation. pushed Jeff past his carefully maintained professional composure. "Don't patronize me, Hulk," Jeff said quietly, but loud enough for the surrounding wrestlers to hear. "I heard what you said about unnecessary risks and unsustainable wrestling, about how guys like me are teaching bad habits to the next generation." Hogan's smile faltered slightly. He had been in the wrestling business long enough to recognize when a conversation was about to become confrontational. "Jeff, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. I wasn't talking about you specifically." "Yes, you were," Jeff interrupted, stepping closer. "You were talking about exactly what I do. The ladder matches, the cage dives, the high-risk moves that you think are just shock value and temporary reactions. You were dismissing everything I've built my career on as unsustainable and ultimately worthless." The locker room had gone quiet. Wrestlers who had been celebrating moments before were now watching with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a car accident. This wasn't typical wrestling business. This was generational warfare, and it was getting personal fast. "You want to talk about sustainability?" Jeff's voice rose sharply, carrying 15 years of frustration with wrestling's old guard mentality. "Let's talk about sustainability. I've been taking risks and pushing boundaries for 15 years, and I'm still here, still healthy, still performing, still giving fans something they can't see anywhere else." Jeff gestured around the locker room, where several other high-risk performers were watching the confrontation with growing interest. "You want to talk about teaching bad habits to the next generation? How about we talk about teaching them that playing it safe and doing the same 5 moves for 30 years is the only way to succeed in this business?" The accusation hit its mark. Hogan's face flushed red, not with embarrassment, but with genuine anger. His hands, which had been raised in a peaceful gesture, now clenched into fists that looked capable of serious damage. "Jeff, you need to be careful about what you're saying here," Hogan said, his voice carrying a warning tone that few wrestlers had ever heard. "I've earned my place in this business through decades of connecting with audiences and building sustainable success. My approach works because it gives fans what they want while protecting the performer." "What fans want?" Jeff shot back, his voice now loud enough to be heard throughout the locker room. "Or what's comfortable for Hulk Hogan? Because I've seen what fans really want, and it's not the same predictable performance they've been watching for 30 years. The personal nature of Jeff's attack was escalating beyond typical backstage disagreements. This was about fundamental philosophy, creative vision, and the direction of professional wrestling as an art form. "You know what really gets me about your attitude, Hulk?" Jeff continued, his voice carrying the passion of someone who had spent his career fighting for recognition of his chosen style. "It's not that you play it safe. That's your choice. It's that you act like playing it safe is the only legitimate way to be a wrestler." Jeff pulled off his shirt, revealing a torso covered in scars, bruises, and the accumulated damage of 15 years of high-risk wrestling. "You see these marks? Each one represents a moment when I chose to give fans something extraordinary instead of something safe. You see these scars? That's what happens when you're willing to put your body on the line for art." The visual impact was undeniable. Jeff's body told the story of a performer who had genuinely sacrificed physical comfort for creative expression, while Hogan's unmarked physique suggested a more cautious approach to wrestling performance. "You've never pushed boundaries the way wrestlers of my generation have," Jeff said, his voice now carrying absolute conviction. "You've spent 30 years in a comfort zone, doing what was safe and familiar, while guys like me have been reinventing what wrestling can be." The silence that followed was profound. Jeff had just accused Hulk Hogan, wrestling's most successful performer, of being creatively stagnant and overly cautious. In a locker room full of wrestlers and staff, this was either career suicide or a statement that would change how people thought about risk and innovation in wrestling. "You're too scared and too old to understand what real wrestling looks like today," Jeff said, delivering his final accusation with the confidence of someone who believed he was speaking for an entire generation of performers. Hulk Hogan stood perfectly still for exactly 8 seconds, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, hurt, and finally a cold determination that anyone who knew him well would recognize as dangerous. During those 8 seconds, the entire locker room held its breath, waiting to see how wrestling's biggest legend would respond to being called scared and out of touch by one of the industry's most innovative performers. When Hogan finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more authority and wisdom than any shout could have conveyed. Every word was precisely chosen, delivered with the kind of controlled intensity that comes from decades of dealing with challenges both inside and outside the wrestling ring. "Jeff," Hogan said, never breaking eye contact, "you're absolutely right about one thing. I am older than you. I have been more cautious with my body than you've been with yours, and I have stuck to a formula that worked rather than constantly reinventing what I do." The admission stunned everyone within earshot. Hulk Hogan never admitted to being cautious, never acknowledged avoiding risks, never confirmed what high-risk wrestlers had always suspected about his conservative approach to wrestling. "But you're wrong about everything else," Hogan continued, his voice growing stronger while remaining completely controlled. "Dead wrong, and the fact that you can't see the difference proves that for all your innovation and risk-taking, you still don't understand what this business is really about." The power dynamic in the conversation had shifted completely. Hogan was now the one delivering the education, and Jeff was being forced to listen to a perspective he had never seriously considered. "You think wrestling is about pushing boundaries and taking risks," Hogan said. "You think innovation means finding new ways to hurt yourself for crowd reaction. But real innovation in this business is about finding ways to connect with audiences that last longer than the time it takes for your next injury to heal." Hogan gestured toward Jeff's scarred torso, which was still exposed as evidence of his commitment to high-risk wrestling. "Those scars tell a story about your dedication, and I respect that. But they also tell a story about sustainability that you're choosing to ignore." The response was gaining momentum, and Jeff was beginning to realize he might have underestimated his opponent. "You want to talk about what real wrestling looks like today?" Hogan asked. "Real wrestling today is about creating characters and stories that can evolve and grow over decades, not just spectacular moments that end careers early." Hogan stepped closer to Jeff, close enough that only Jeff could hear his next words clearly. "You call me scared. I call it strategic. You call me old. I call it experienced. You call me approach outdated. I call it proven." The words were having their intended effect. Jeff's confidence was beginning to waver as he was forced to confront the possibility that his approach to wrestling, while innovative and exciting, might have limitations he hadn't considered. "My comfort zone that you're so critical of?" Hogan continued, his voice returning to normal volume. "That comfort zone allowed me to have a 30-year career, to main event WrestleMania across 4 different decades, to build wrestling into a global phenomenon that supports thousands of wrestlers and their families." The education was continuing, and Jeff was being forced to examine his own assumptions about what constituted success and innovation in professional wrestling. "You want to know what the real difference is between us, Jeff?" Hogan asked. "You're focused on impressing wrestling fans with how much pain you can absorb. I focused on impressing the entire world with how compelling wrestling could be as entertainment." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be devastating. Jeff had indeed built his reputation primarily within wrestling circles, while Hogan had successfully brought wrestling to mainstream audiences who had never cared about the industry before. The locker room remained silent for several more seconds as both men processed what had just happened. Finally, Jeff spoke, his voice much quieter now, almost uncertain. "So you're saying that taking risks and pushing boundaries doesn't contribute to wrestling's growth?" he asked. I'm saying that risks and innovation are valuable when they serve a larger purpose, Hogan replied simply. When they help build something that lasts, but when they become ends in themselves, when the risk is more important than the story it's supposed to tell, that's when they become self-destructive instead of constructive. The conversation that followed lasted another 30 minutes, with the initial confrontation evolving into something resembling a master class in wrestling philosophy. Hogan explained how his conservative approach had been designed to build a sustainable foundation for wrestling's growth, while Jeff shared his perspective on how risk-taking and innovation had kept wrestling relevant for newer generations of fans. By the end, what had started as a bitter accusation about being scared and out of touch had become a dialogue about different approaches to entertaining audiences and building lasting careers. "I owe you an apology," Jeff said as their conversation wound down. "What I said about you being scared and too old was out of line. You weren't scared, you were smart about building something that could last." Hogan extended his hand, and they shook with genuine respect and understanding. "And you've reminded me that wrestling needs innovators who are willing to take risks I never would have taken. Your willingness to push boundaries has kept this business exciting and unpredictable." The impact of their confrontation was felt immediately throughout WWE. Other high-risk wrestlers who learned about the exchange began to see Hogan's conservative approach differently, recognizing how it had created the mainstream foundation that allowed their own innovative styles to reach larger audiences. Wrestling historians would later point to this locker room confrontation as a turning point in understanding how different wrestling philosophies could coexist and complement each other rather than compete for legitimacy. The phrase, "You're too scared and too old," became a reminder within WWE that generational differences in wrestling approach could lead to mutual education if both parties were willing to examine their own assumptions honestly. 8 seconds of silence had transformed a potential career-damaging feud into an opportunity for learning about the balance between innovation and sustainability in professional wrestling. The confrontation proved that sometimes the most valuable conversations happened when wrestlers were willing to challenge each other's fundamental beliefs about what their art form should be.